kind introduction, and thanks, Jeff, for having me. I've really been enjoying all these talks. I come from a bit of a different background, where I haven't studied deception in the lab. I kind of came at this by accident. I was doing a PhD in economics and kind of became obsessed with Google search data and all the things you can learn about it, particularly the things that people frequently lie about. So I hope you find this talk interesting, and if not, at least interesting, and then maybe you'll figure out some ways to apply this to some of your research, because I do think there's so much information now online where people are more honest than they are in other ways. And I think no matter what field you're in, you can get insights from some of this new data. So I'm going to describe some of the work I've been doing. It's about 5 years of research. It started during my PhD program. It continued while I worked at Google, and then it culminated in this book, Everybody Lies, which is all the things we can learn about people on potentially sensitive topics from their internet behavior, particularly their searches. All right, so the starting point of the research is that for the past 80 years, if you want to understand why people do the things they do, what they're going to do, what they've done in the past, the main way is to ask them to conduct some sort of survey. So Pew or Gallup or whoever will put these questions out. And the main problem with this approach is that on sensitive topics, people may lie. Social desirability bias, they may tell the survey not the truth, but something that will make themselves feel good or they think will impress the surveyor. So there are many examples of this. I'm sure you've come across them in your own work. My favorite is on sexuality, that the General Social Survey every year asks Americans how frequently you have sex, whether it's heterosexual or homosexual sex, and then if you're using a condom in these sexual encounters. And you can actually add them up, you do the math. And if you do that, it shows that women say they use 1.1 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters, and men say they use 1.6 billion condoms every year in heterosexual sexual encounters. And I want you to realize these obviously by definition have to be the same, right? There are a certain number of condoms used every year in heterosexual sexual encounters, so we kind of already know from this that somebody's not telling the truth, not being honest about sexual behavior. So you can actually test this. Nielsen collects data on every condom sold in the United States every year. So who's telling the truth, men or women? Neither. Only 600 million are sold every year. Basically, it seems everybody's lying about sex, not men, just more than women. It's not clear from this, are men or women lying about using protection when they have sex or how frequently they have sex. But if you actually do the math on sexual encounters, reported sexual encounters with women of pregnancy age using no contraception, if Americans were really having as much unprotected sex as they had, and you do scientific analyses of pregnancy rates, there would be more pregnancies every year. So I think in the United States, there's a sex-obsessed culture. I think people tend to exaggerate. Both men and women now tend to exaggerate how frequently they're having sex. All right, so digital truth serum. That's where this research started. This idea that there is some source now where people are unusually honest and they're comfortable telling Google things that they might not tell anybody else. And you can kind of think about this from your own experience, or there's proof, I think, in a lot of academic papers where they've shown that they've asked people, and people even admit that they're more honest on Google than they are to other sources. They might tell Google things that they might not tell to anybody else. And you also can start analyzing this data, and on this aggregate, when we put together everybody's searches protecting privacy, we frequently see a different picture than the one that comes up in surveys when people might be dishonest on sensitive topics. So an example, this is Google Trends. This is the tool I use. If you don't, you can just literally Google Trends and start playing around with the data and finding all these neat, interesting patterns. This is one example. Porn is searched, historically has been searched more frequently than weather in the United States, which is very different from surveys where only about 25% of men and 8% of women say that they watch porn. So you already see on Google, I think, a different picture of people than you get in surveys. Why are people so honest on Google? Well, we know the conditions in which people are more honest, in which social desirability bias is lower. So people are more honest when they're online, and Google obviously they're online. They're more honest when they're alone on Google frequently. Most frequently you're alone. They're more honest when you're not being watched, when there's not a human being talking to you or in the same room as you. And obviously that's usually true in Google's case. But I think more fundamentally, and something that surveys can never offer, is you have an incentive to tell the truth. So in a survey, an anonymous survey, you might not have an incentive to lie, but you don't necessarily have an incentive to tell the truth. But on Google, you have an incentive to say what information you really want. So that's something that I think Google offers that a survey never can, and it's a reason that people are so honest on Google, more honest than any other place. That's one reason, but to be honest, one of the most surprising things I found in this research, and I still do not understand it, and if anybody can explain this to me, I would be curious. But people use Google now not only to ask questions, what's the weather, or some obvious reason where you're looking for Google for information, but they now confess to Google, and they just type full sentences when it's not clear. You can see some examples here when it's not clear how Google's going to help them in this situation, or what from Google to get it. And I don't know, it's definitely interesting. I think it's kind of, my hypothesis, and I don't really know, it's a fascinating area if somebody wants to research what's going on here. It seems to be happening in large numbers. It's maybe because people are telling Google things that they don't normally tell, they just get very comfortable and they treat it like a confessional or a therapist, and you're just kind of talking to it and not realizing, that that's not the traditional use of Google. But it's definitely very interesting. And another interesting, it gives interesting pieces of data that we don't see. All right, so back to the sex thing. If you talk, remember, people exaggerate how frequently they have sex. Only about, I think, 1% of married people on Google say they've gone the past year without having sex. But if you look on Google, the number one complaint about marriage by far, about I think 10 times more than loveless or unhappy marriage, is that it's a sexless marriage. It's a very different perception of marriage than you see in surveys. The number one complaint that everybody has about their partner, whether it's a husband, wife, boyfriend, or girlfriend, is that the partner won't have sex with me. And easily eats the second complaint that the partner won't text me back. And you start to see things that kind of go against conventional wisdom. So this definitely surprised me. There are twice as many complaints that a boyfriend won't have sex with me than a girlfriend won't have sex with me, although in I think traditional culture, we usually think of younger men as wanting sex all the time and women being more withholding. So definitely a different view of people than we usually see. All right, so the way I started this research was way back, and this feels like forever ago, but when Obama was first elected president in 2008, you might remember before his election and immediately after his election, there was this big question: did Americans care that he was black when they were voting for him? So how many Americans cared that he was black when they were making their voting decision? And the general consensus that came out of a lot of research, which was based on surveys, was that this was not a big factor in Americans' voting decision. So if Gallup asked Americans, do you care that Obama was black when you were voting? And 98, 99% of Americans said, no, of course not. We would never care that Obama was black. That's not how we do things in these situations. And that allowed, combined with Obama's victory, people to say that we lived in a post-racial society, that we moved beyond this, that we moved beyond a society where people would judge political candidates based on the color of their skin. And so one of the earliest things I put into Google Trends that was really disturbing and shocking to me at the time was the frequency with which people were making racist searches. So this is the percent of Google searches that include the N-word, not the N-word, but like the actual N-word. And in the time period I was looking, it was searched about as frequently as migrant and economist and Lakers and Daily Show, so not a fringe search by any stretch of imagination. Millions of these searches every year. So I was kind of, I was pretty blown away by that people were making this search so frequently, and immediately my idea was, rap lyrics. Of course, people are searching up rap lyrics, which sometimes we use this word. Well, no, the word in rap lyrics tends to be the version that ends in A, not the version that ends in ER, and that gives totally different data. So what are people doing when they're making these searches in such large numbers? And frequently, they're searching for jokes, mocking, humiliating, disparaging African Americans. So that's kind of a big theme of these searches. Another thing that was really striking when I saw this data was the map looked very different from the map that I would have expected. So in this map, darker red means higher search volume, lighter red means lower search volume. A few white spots are areas that don't have data in that. And I think if you had asked me before I started this research, where is racism highest in the United States, I would have guessed that it would be predominantly concentrated in the Deep South. If you think of the country's history, the Civil War, we usually think of racism as having a north-south divide. And definitely among the areas where racism is the highest, according to Google, are Louisiana, parts of southern Louisiana and southern Mississippi, and South Carolina as well. But right up at the top as well, the number one state is West Virginia, upstate New York, parts of upstate New York, very high, industrial Michigan, western Pennsylvania, eastern Ohio. I think if you look at this graph, the real divide is not necessarily north versus south, but more east versus west. You can see it's much lighter as you get west in the western part of the country. So initially, and you can read the paper was eventually published in the Journal of Public Economics if you want to check it out, but I was using this to test the effects that Obama's race had on voting, and what you see is very, very clearly in the same parts of the country where this map is darker red, Obama does far worse than previous Democratic candidates had done, white Democratic candidates had done, and this relationship survives numerous controls. It doesn't show up in different in how changes in House voting or changes in Senate voting. It's basically limited to in these parts of the country that are red. Obama got a lot fewer votes than previous Democratic candidates had, to the point that large numbers of Americans, I said 10% of white Americans, did not vote for Obama just because of the color of his skin, compared to the 1% that was showing up under Gallup. And it seemed kind of crazy. Actually, one of the comments, which I'm sure all of us have an experience with this in our academic careers, is that this can't be true. Was one of the comments that was being rejected. There can't be this many racist people in the United States. There's just no way. But I think now I think that's maybe more less something that would come up. So actually, more recently, we've had a Republican presidential candidate who has definitely said some racially charged things. Who said some racially charged things in the primary that I think a lot of people would have thought would have derailed candidacy in the United States in the 21st century. So when Trump was rising, when his candidacy wasn't falling apart despite saying all these things, there was a question, okay, is racism explaining this? And this is Nate Cohn, a data journalist with the New York Times, had collected data on support for Donald Trump in the Republican primary, and he asked me for the racism data that I had from Google that I first used to study the Obama election, and he said that it was the single strongest, highest predictor he could find of Trump support in the Republican primary was this indicator of racism. And again, kind of Trump's map in the early support was what was driving Trump was again an east-west divide much more than a north-south divide. So I think it really came back the same secret racism that was hurting Obama, even if it wasn't being picked up by the traditional sources, then helped carry Trump to victory. So I think that does show the power of knowing some of these secrets that people don't otherwise tell.
Is that per capita or does it actual number?
So this is per search rate, which I think is even better. So it's of a percent of total searches. So the percent of total searches that include the word. Yeah. So in other words, if a place makes more searches, California is not going to be arbitrarily higher because it makes more searches and stuff. I think you just see all kinds of patterns in this data that are different from the ones we see. Otherwise, Gallup also asked people, are you gay, in surveys? And one of the things that you see in this data is that there are huge differences in the gay population, according to surveys, in different parts of the United States, where it's much higher. The gay population is much higher in Rhode Island, the state with the highest support for gay marriage, than it is in Mississippi, the state with the lowest support of gay marriage. And then the question is this real? Are there really more gay men in Rhode Island than there are in Mississippi? And one way to test this, actually look at it as a whole bunch of ways, using social media data on how much gay men move in different parts of the country, and lots of other sources of data. But one, I think, a piece of data that's useful is pornography searches. So this is using a whole bunch of sources to try to estimate the percent of male pornography searches that are for gay male porn searches in different parts of the country. And you do see there's slightly more gay male pornography searches in places where it's easier to be gay, in places like Rhode Island than Mississippi, because some people who were born in Mississippi, some gay men who were born in Mississippi moved to Rhode Island, but the differences are much less small. So it's about 5% everywhere, in contrast to surveys where there are huge differences, and actually lower than 5% everywhere. So I think that's number one search that starts "is my husband" is my husband gay? It's 10% more common than "is my husband cheating," and 8 times more common than "is my husband depressed," and 10 times more common than "is my husband alcoholic?" And 21 of the 25 searches where this is most common are places where it's where support for gay marriage is below the national average, where this data suggests there are indeed a lot of gay closeted men. So it's kind of like you can look at this data a whole bunch of different ways and get kind of a consistent story of the closet still being factored in parts of the country where attitudes towards gays are still not so great. All right, it's just more and more. I've just been doing so much of this research and so surprised by all the things you learn and disturbed sometimes. I'm not going to lie, disturbed by this. This is, one of the things you learn in this data is sometimes the bubbles we live in. This is something that wasn't even on my mind. I didn't even think in the United States of anything about self-induced abortion. It was not something, it's not something I thought that these days were long behind us in the United States. And I was looking through the data on self-induced abortion. I kind of was shocked by, first of all, how frequently Americans now make searches for self-induced abortion. So these are searches, and again, warn you, really, really disturbing searches for how to give yourself a miscarriage, how to induce a miscarriage, how to induce abortion, vitamin C abortion, even coat hanger, how to have a coat hanger abortion, really, really disturbing. These are made, if you put together all the different variants of this, there are about 800,000 of these every year in the United States. There are only about, I think, about a few million searches for legal abortion, like abortion clinics, and I think a little over 1 million official abortions. The numbers might be slightly off, but it's basically it's just really shocking. You would think that there would be maybe 1,000 searches for legal abortions for every search for self-induced abortion. That's what I would have thought, but it's not. It's more like 6 to 1. It's really, really disturbing. And you see the map on the top is data from the Guttmacher Institute on how attitudes towards abortion, with orange places being more hostile to abortion, and the map on the bottom is search rates for self-induced abortion, percent Google searches that are for these, how to give yourself a miscarriage, how to induce a miscarriage, with orange being higher. You see really, really strong relationship. The other thing is that you see the time series of these searches. These started rising in 2011, shot up substantially, rose about 80% in 2011, which is a year when parts of the United States started cracking down on legal abortion. And there wasn't any change in Canada. It didn't have this crackdown, so it's really clear in this data the effects that being hostile to abortion, making it difficult to get an abortion, can have on people. I think this data doesn't mean that women are going through with having self-induced abortion, but if they actually look at data on legal abortions and birth, there seems to be many missing pregnancies that aren't appearing in Mississippi and Tennessee that I think this data, when you put it all together, is probably contributing to. So, okay, everyone looks really horrified, but I mean, I think, that there are definitely kind of these truths or uncomfortable truths, and, I kind of intentionally make it, particularly in the book, uncomfortable at points, because I want people to see that some of the things that we see in traditional data sources are missing a lot of pain and trauma and struggle that people are in, and for people to realize, it's pretty horrifying to see 800,000 searches like this and to know what's going on, and, I think, it should be horrifying, and I'm glad that as researchers now we have access to this data and can maybe learn more about it. All right, this may be a little lighter, so if you kind of think of the research that I've done, that I've talked about so far, I said that racist parts of the country didn't support Obama and supported Trump. I said that there are closeted gay men in parts of the country where it's hard to be gay. I said that there are a lot of people start searching for self-induced abortion when it becomes hard to get a legal abortion. I'm not sure that any of those by itself really shock anybody. They're maybe would be hard to document by using other sources, but I think intuitively we would kind of expect things to at least go in that direction. So if all big data and all this digital truth serum could do was confirm what we already knew, then it wouldn't be so powerful, it wouldn't be so revolutionary. But I think sometimes, frequently, this data brings up stuff that we would have never otherwise known about. So this is one of my favorite findings. The top way that people in India complete the following phrase, "my husband wants," and you can guess if you try to think at home, if you're trying to think there by yourself. Nobody's going to guess it if they haven't seen it already. But, the top way is my husband wants me to breastfeed him. And that's like India and nowhere else. I wasn't going to include this, but we're having dinner and band. I thought it would liven up the conversation. And I'll discuss what we made of this finding. But I think that's definitely kind of, there are things in this data that, you know, it's kind of amusing, but it's also kind of like, literally after I published this finding, and it's not just cherry picking like my husband wants. If you do tips on breastfeeding, in pretty much every country in the world, not surprisingly, if you search for tips of breastfeeding or how to breastfeed a child, but if you look at India, they're equally split between how to breastfeed a child and how to breastfeed a husband. And after I published this finding, there was, it kind of got some media attention. They started interviewing people in India, and everyone just said, no, this doesn't exist. We don't know what you're talking about. And like at this point in my research, I've been doing this so much, I prefer to get answers like that, because I'm like, I'm 100% sure no matter what they say, like the data confirms that a reasonable number of people in India and nowhere else have this kind of desire. So it is kind of, it does kind of show that there can be something that's going on below the surface that if it's considered shameful or embarrassing for whatever reason, we just never would otherwise know about, but we now can know about using this data. All right, so I think a lot of people kind of group together big data together, and I think that's really dangerous. All big data is not the same. If you think of the main advantage that Google offers, I think it's that it gives you an incentive to tell the truth. And if you think of the other big data source that exists now, the biggest data source except aside from Google, it's Facebook, and I think Facebook is not really so good at getting people to admit things that they're uncomfortable about. I think Facebook is even worse than surveys in many ways, because you actually have an incentive to make yourself look good to your friends, so it's even worse than an anonymous survey where you don't necessarily have an incentive to tell the truth, but you don't have an incentive to lie. In Facebook, you do have an incentive to exaggerate parts of you that look good to impress your friends. You see this over and over when you analyze Facebook data. So if you compare the Atlantic and the National Enquirer, they get the National Enquirer actually it's a weekly, but so it's a little unfair, but it actually sells more copies every year in the United States. But if you look at likes on Facebook, the National Enquirer, the Atlantic is 45 times more popular than the National Enquirer, and of course we know what's going on here, right? People don't want their friends to think that they're reading the National Enquirer, which is kind of trashy. They want them to think they're very intellectual and reading the Atlantic magazine. So that kind of shows, I think, that you have to be careful in using Facebook data to understand people, because there is this big incentive to impress your friends and not necessarily say what you're really doing, who you really are. Michael kind of stole my thunder on this one, but I'll do it anyway. It's interesting to compare the different ways that people describe their husbands on social media and searches. So these are the top 5. If you complete the phrase "my husband is" on social media, the top 5 ways people to complete that on Facebook is the best, my best friend, amazing, the greatest, and so cute, which is a very nice view of marriage, I guess, but may not be totally accurate. So you can also look at Google searches. Again, a little weird to make a search "my husband is," but people do. So what are the top 5 ways to make searches "my husband is" on Google? The third actually is amazing, which is kind of nice, but so that one kind of checks out, but then the other ones are gay and sure. Definitely a different view of marriage on Google and Facebook. Not necessarily clear which ones, that one's exactly right, but it is definitely a contrast from social media and searches. Actually, there's a line from Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't know if they originally came up with it, but it's don't compare your insides to other people's outsides. And I think the 21st century big data update would be don't compare your Google searches to other people's Facebook profiles. Because that kind of shows the difference in the ways that it do that. All right, so the things that I'm talking about are kind of documenting things that exist. But I think this data is ultimately more powerful than that. Ultimately, we don't just want to understand the world. We don't just want to understand, okay, there are closet gay men, there are a lot of racists, there are a lot of people looking for self-induced abortions. We want to ultimately change the world. And can we use this data to kind of try to, which is so honest, to try to change the world? And I think you can. I'll end with one example of this, which is also kind of disturbing, but I think in the end uplifting. So let's start. make searches, there are some people who make searches of a really nasty type about Muslim people, particularly after certain events. So they search things in their computer, kill Muslims, or I hate Muslims, or Muslims are terrorists, or Muslims are evil, or no Syrian refugees, or lots of things like that. And these can go up after certain key events. So immediately after the San Bernardino attack in December 2015, when two Muslim Americans shot up and killed a group of people in San Bernardino, immediately after this attack, like within hours of this attack, the top search with the word Muslims in it was kill Muslims. Which again, it's not clear like what that search is, but it's kind of imagine someone with a very angry mindset, really kind of enraged, looking to do bad things. And these might seem, okay, well, what does it even mean to make these searches, kill Muslims, or hate Muslims? Well, we've actually done research on this. We compared this to data on hate crimes in different places in the United States in different weeks. And you see very, very clearly when more people are making these seemingly insane searches, kill Muslims, I hate Muslims, these enraged searches, there are more hate crimes against Muslims. So these searches have meaning. We know that when people are making these searches, there are more mosques shut up, there are more attacks of Muslim Americans in general. So these are these are not these are predictive of real offline bad behaviors. So after the San Bernardino attack, about 6 days later, Barack Obama wanted to give a speech about Islamophobia because he realized that something had kind of gotten out of control in the United States, that there was so much animosity and there were reports of hate crimes and stuff against Muslim Americans, that he wanted to give a speech, kind of a primetime address to the country to kind of calm people down about Muslim Americans. And it was a nationally televised speech. It got a lot of attention, and it was, I definitely thought, a beautiful speech. He talked about how it's the responsibility of all Americans to reject discrimination, how it's our responsibility to not give in to fear, to appeal to freedom, how it's our responsibility as Americans not to judge people based on their faith. We wouldn't want to be judged on their faith. We shouldn't judge other people based on their faith. And it got a lot of attention, got great reviews. The New York Times said it was a great speech, kind of did everything it was supposed to. Really good job by the president. The LA Times said the same thing. Newsweek said the same thing. Everybody said this is a great speech. And so we were actually working. I was working with Evan Soltas, who was then at Princeton, on research at the time on Islamophobia. When Obama gave a speech, we were working on an article for this, and we said, okay, let's see if he calmed people down. We had seen all these people making these searches for kill Muslims, not hate Muslims. What happened after Obama's speech? So we compared these searches. You can actually break the data down basically minute by minute, before, during, and after Obama's speech. And we saw that from Obama's speech, not only was there not a decrease in these searches, they didn't stay the same, they went way up and stayed up afterwards. So every time Obama was telling people about their responsibility, more of these people were searching kill Muslims, I hate Muslims, die Muslims, whatever, all these horrible searches from enraged people. So it seemed like everything that Obama was doing, even though it got great reviews, was actually backfiring in its main purpose, which was calming this enraged mob. So did anything from this speech work? There was one line near the end of the speech where Obama took a somewhat different path, and he said that we have to remember that Muslim Americans are our friends and neighbors. They're our sports heroes, and they're the men and women who will die for our country. And you can look at the Google search data. Literally within 30 seconds of Obama making this search, a huge rise in search for Muslim athletes and Muslim soldiers. In fact, for the first time in many, many years, the top descriptor of Muslim Americans on Google was not Muslim terrorists or Muslim refugees or Muslim extremists. It was Muslim athletes, and that kept the top spot for a week afterwards. And you see people all around, kind of you see on these sites, people are talking, Muhammad Ali was Muslim, Shaquille O'Neal was Muslim, it's kind of starting this conversation. And Evan Soltas and I wrote this up in the New York Times, and we suggested, okay, let's see, kind of compare two different paths to trying to change people's minds. The first is lecturing them and using words like responsibility and telling them things they've heard 1,000 times, not to judge people based on their faith. And the second path is provoking curiosity, offering new information, changing how people, the stereotypes people might have about the group that is causing them so much hatred. And we publish this in the Times, and I don't think it's totally crazy when you publish something in the Times that powerful people read it, even possibly people in Obama's staff, because a few weeks later, Obama gave another speech in a Baltimore mosque. And again, it got a lot of attention. Again, it was nationally televised. And this speech was totally different. He stopped with the sermon, stopped with the lecture, no talk of responsibility. Instead, he really doubled down on a curiosity. He said how Muslim Americans are farmers and merchants who built this country. They built the skyscraper in Chicago. Thomas Jefferson had a copy of the Quran. It's kind of changing how people thought about Muslim Americans and the place of Muslim Americans in our country's history. And we looked at these searches afterwards, and many of the searches, most of the searches that were nasty about Muslim Americans after this speech actually dropped. So I don't want to say from 2 speeches we've learned how to end hatred in the world, but I do think that it is suggestive more about the methodology. That if you think of the average laboratory experiment, so if you think of the average survey, it's not going to necessarily have the small angry mob, even though the small angry mob creates a lot of problems in society. And if you think about a laboratory experiment at a university, they're not going to necessarily recruit these people to study them. So this is really, really tough thing to study, kind of an angry mob in real time. But because of this internet data, this minute-by-minute search data of people expressing really vicious thoughts, we can really maybe turn something as seemingly chaotic as how to calm an angry mob into a real science. So I think it is suggestive of just how powerful this data is on really, really important questions that can help fundamentally change society. And that's it. My book is Everybody Lies. It can be bought on Amazon. I'm supposed to get a bookseller here, but I forgot to do that. Yeah, it's and again, people, if they want to email me, questions they have about how to do this research, if you're interested in using Google Trends. Again, I think it's such a fertile area and still underused. You see more and more this as a tool used by researchers in many areas, but I still think relative to its power, it's underutilized. Because in any field, I kind of have this principle that any topic, if you look at Google Trends, there will be something interesting there and different and surprising, just because it's people are so honest and there's so many people making searches, data from all around the world. So there's just so much information now from people's searches to kind of mine. So I guess open it up to questions.
Sure. Okay, who would like to ask Seth a question?
So I was wondering, and this is more of a clarifying question, but with the searches, the trends that you look at, does it take into account people searching multiple times?
Yeah, so it's not, it eliminates, if you make the same search or the same search in a small period of time, it'll just count it as one search. So if you keep searching like, I guess the example of Muslim, I kill Muslim, I hate Muslim. If you keep on doing that in an hour, it's not going to be counted as everybody. But it doesn't distinguish over longer periods of time. Now it's not clear. Ideally, we have both. We have just like the percent of people that made a particular search, and like how frequently they make it. One of the issues with I think it's not clear it's a disadvantage or an advantage, right? You could say that if someone makes a lot of racist searches, they're really racist. If someone makes one racist search, they're less racist. So as far as terms of the level of racism in an area, it's probably good to give more weight to the people who are making a lot of racist searches. But ideally, we would have that as well. But now we don't. So it's just total searches accept unless it's in a small period, a small window of time.
And can I follow up on that really quick? And then so do you consider that when you compare it to surveys? Like, I mean, I agree that looking at these trends paints a much clearer picture, but comparing it to the surveys where people, I mean, obviously the differences are enormous, but if you consider that when you're trying to make a comparison between like what survey people say and like the percentage of people or the percentage of searches.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to go from this, like from the absolute number of searches to to a number of people for the exact reason you mentioned. So you can't say, okay, like, this many million people make racist searches, this is how many billion people are racist. Like, you can't do that. What you can do is say, these areas make this in a lot more searches than these other areas. It doesn't predict stuff, and it seems to predict things a lot better than surveys. Or even for the example of homosexuality of gay males. I think it's hard to even just say that, from the percent of searches that are gay, how many men are gay, maybe gay men watch porn more than non-gay men. There are like a lot of things going on, but I think the really interesting pattern is that the differences are so much smaller than the differences in surveys at the area level. So I think that's probably more telling than, I think you do have to definitely be dangerous from the absolute. Just like, you just say this many people make this search, that's how many people have it. I think we don't at this point really know how to do that. I think the ultimate way to do that might be combining this data with surveys in some way and using some sort of model building and then extrapolating out or something. But that's not really doable, and I wouldn't recommend it at this point.
Okay, and just to test everyone's desire to ask a question, it would be great if people that wanted to ask a question would go up to the mic, or you can line up at the mic if you want. That will then benefit all of our live feed listeners as well, so that they can also hear the question. So, without further ado.
Okay, I'm curious if you're able to track the links of the URLs that people go to when they get the return on their search. So if you, and then if there's been any internal discussions at Google that turns out, return, like someone who's going to kill Muslims, you could return at the top of the list Muslim athletes. Have you talked about that?
The data I have is basically as simple as it's just like aggregate data on searches people make, and there's nothing really more than that. That data does exist somewhere, so it would be cool to make it available to academics. There's an interesting story about search data that I don't know how many people are familiar with, but back in, I think, 2005, some academics asked AOL for their data. They kind of had a similar idea to me, like this, we learned a lot about people, we saw their data, and AOL said, sure, let's just make sure it's anonymous. So they basically de-identified the same users over time, and what they clicked on and what they searched for, like over a 2-month period of time. They didn't think twice. It wasn't a big discussion at AOL. And then some people realized that even though it was de-identified, you could figure out who someone was because they searched for themselves, and then maybe directions to their address and a lot of other things, and they searched for something embarrassing or something. So and I think since then there's been a lot of justifiable paranoia among search companies. That's definitely a story that's told a lot at Google when they're kind of making decisions about helping with academic research. I think correctly there's a fear of, I think privacy is a fundamental, you really don't want to compromise someone's privacy in these situations. So there is a real danger that with what comes up on a site. I think I was talking to someone who's doing research on this as well, but there used to be, if you made searches for suicidal behavior, someone pointed out that you could make a search like how to kill yourself, and because people can be really, really nasty on the internet, and Google's results were entirely based on a formula, some of the first things that came up were like message boards, do it, like your life is not worth it, like if you're thinking this, you should end it or something, and just really, really nasty stuff. And Google's, when they saw this, they're like, okay, they had this principle, we just like to be an algorithm, we don't like to influence things, we just like to step back. They said, okay, in this case, we have to interject. We can't let a 16-year-old searching how to kill yourself be created with a mob saying that you should kill yourself. So they changed to put the suicide hotline right at the top and stuff like that. So it could be something that you see. I don't know if they've done stuff with Muslim Americans, but there's just a lot of talk now. In the way that neo-Nazi stuff, hosting these websites. I mean, we're moving this area where some of these issues are so important, and there is so much now data that helps understand them. Where I think companies are going to start asking what responsibility they have to potentially, the information they show people in certain mindsets.
So I'm wondering, really, is this really who we are? Isn't this possibly a reflection of some novelty in these searches? For example, using what you recommended, I compared sunburn and skin rash. And your sunburn levels are really low, skin rashes are much higher. But does that necessarily mean that people are having more sunburns and skin rashes, or is it just for a sunburn, but I don't know what to do for a skin rash. So I'm wondering how much of this is just reflecting like new or unique problems in a population versus who we really are, or what we're about. Do you understand?
Yeah, I definitely understand. I think it's definitely a good point. I think I definitely warrant caution for that very reason and how you interpret it. So if you compare twice as many searches for my boyfriend having sex, one of sex with my girlfriend having sex, it may just be that it's so shocking to
Yes, exactly.
a young woman that when a boyfriend doesn't, that she says like, I need to make a search about this. And I think I think it's very dangerous to go from that to say that there are twice as many boyfriends withholding sex. I think what we can do is that maybe it's a more common issue than we usually let on. I think that would be a fair interpretation of the data to say that, okay, it's probably younger men avoiding sex maybe happening more frequently in real life based on data. And I think, so I think you do have to be careful, even just comparing my husband is. I don't think that the Google searches are the right measure of marriage versus Facebook measure. It might be that if your marriage is going well, you're not going to make a Google search about it, you're going to make a search. But it's just interesting that you have these two different. It kind of just shows how different incentives lead to different types of data. So definitely agree that you have to be careful. I think one thing that doesn't really show up in the data, you could think from that. Like when I first did the racism research, some people are like, well, if they're really racist, they know all the jokes and they wouldn't have to search for them. Which is kind of an extension of your point a little bit.
Yeah.
But that rarely comes up in the data. Like you don't see that, if you see sunburn, you're not going to see, like I would guarantee you that sunburn is not going to be highest in like Vermont because they never have sunburn. So when they have sunburns, they're going to have to. Like I bet, without having seen the data, I would guarantee that it's like Florida, Hawaii, like it's not.
We'll look at it after.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. So like that. So like yeah. So I think there is. You can't take that argument too far, where like the data becomes meaningless, or like the data becomes, instead of a measure of interest, it becomes a measure of lack of knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
Which I don't think, from my experience in the data, has rarely ever shown up. So if you look at like conservative websites, where's the Georgia Report search? It's conservative parts of the country, even though like you could say they already know the site, they have it on their homepage, they don't need. They don't need to search that, but it still kind of shows up. Or where is God searched the most, or the Bible searched the most? It's the Bible Belt. You could say, okay, the same thing, that they already know all the Bible quotes. Why are they searching Bible quotes? But still, it shows up in that way. So.
Okay, next question. We have time, I think, for a couple more. Maybe.
This will be real quick. I promise this is like the least controversial question anyone can ask. There's a tendency here, it's all correlational data, right?
It's the data. Well, I mean, like, sort of. Like, the change in policy around abortion is not really correlational. And,
well, you didn't manipulate that.
it's a natural experiment or something. Yeah, okay.
That's right. So there's a tendency, and I heard it through a couple examples, but I won't bring any of the specifics up, to take something that was very correlational and make a causal claim about it. I'd like to hear your perspective on that, what you think that means for big data, what you think it means for deception, etc.
Yeah, I think it can go too far in the other direction, where you say it's correlation, not causation, and that just like stops the discussion. I think the question is, do you have an alternative explanation? So if you say that places that make a lot of racist searches supported Barack Obama a lot less in 2008 than they didn't support John Kerry in 2004, and you say, okay, well, is that because trends? And then you control for trends. Is that, and it doesn't change the result? You say that because of demographics and it doesn't change the result. Is that because of like gun policy? We had that and it doesn't change the result. Or you start doing a bunch of things and then you say doesn't change the result. I think you can go from that to say, okay, I think racism played a causal role there. So I don't think an experiment is the only way to make a causal claim. But yeah, I mean, if you have a correlation, sure, you have to question. You have to see it on a case by case. Like I have to see a criticism of a particular study and say, okay, this is why I think it is causal. But.
Interesting talk. I understand that you used all public data for this, but I just had a question. If you knew if the search engines and social media sites had IRBs or did ethics reviews?
Well, yeah, there was a big issue around Facebook did a study a while ago. If you elaborate, I guess some people know about it.
That was my study.
Oh.
That's okay, you can say bad things about it, lots of people have.
No, I mean, no, I love the study. I'm just like, I'm just pissed that now it's like, I think what the fallout is, like, this is probably not my place at all to talk on this topic, but I think the IRB thing, like, goes too far at this point and, like, really slows things down. And I think what's going to happen in companies is that they're going to just do experiments without publishing the results because they don't want to deal with some of these issues. So I do think that, like the issue I had with everyone that thought it was really creepy that Facebook's like manipulating people's moods by showing them different news feeds. But I feel like we're always like being manipulated by companies to some, like doing nothing is manipulating to some degree, right? Like I think there's something weird about randomness that people just like over exaggerate that the end of the world is something's randomly happening, but we're impacted by lots of people in like ways that might be helpful or maybe harmful. We don't know by everything. So yeah, that's my really controversial opinion that nobody's going to agree with.
Yeah, so like putting suicide hotline at the top end may be a no-brainer, but it seems like it could be a slippery slope there.
Yeah. The one thing I will say is that the ethical issues. So when I started this book, I was just really interested in human nature and people, and I wasn't really. And I was like, what about the ethics? I'm like, stop. I'm doing research. Like, stop bothering me. And as I got more and more into this, I did start to think that some of the privacy issues are probably more severe than I realized, and like I started thinking more and more about some of these issues. So one of the things that comes up a lot in big data research that isn't directly related to stuff I say is that you can find a correlation. So for example, that I talk about a study in the book where they do a research on a peer-to-peer lending site, Prosper, and you can predict based on the words people use when applying for loans whether they're going to pay it back. And one of the things you find is that if you use the word God, you're less likely to pay back a loan. It's kind of weird and whatever. I don't know what causes that, but then a lender would make more money if they didn't give loans to someone who used the word God. But I think in the future, we're not going to even know all the terms. It's just going to be machine learning models that just say, just predict who's a good case and who's a bad case, and all this stuff is kind of under the hood. So I think big data is kind of moving very, very fast, and it's not really clear that the legal and ethical framework we have is prepared for it. So I will agree on that.
Okay. Is there any last burning question? We do have time for one. There's one more person that would like to ask a question. Everybody good? All right, well, let's have a big round of applause.